Hey, all you beautiful Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think changing our workplace can change our world, I got a real treat for you. We got the one and only Jisha Dymond. Let's get a massive emoji explosion to get going as I run through these announcements. And like I say every week, let's drop those LinkedIn URLs in the chat. Your network is your network. Neither are big enough. And really let us know where you're coming in from today. So hopefully you're not getting hit by the storms. Hopefully it's, this is gonna be a pretty spooky episode given what tomorrow is. So drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat, drop where you're coming from and what you're gonna dress up for Halloween as I run through these announcements. We're of course giving away a bunch of credits like we always do. We're of course giving away a bunch of books. We are featuring this really cool book that's just coming out for all of you fixers out there, all those people like me that feel like you gotta fix everyone's problems. This great new book came out by my friend, Dr. Leah Maroney. It's all about being a serial fixer, how to change those tendencies and be more effective. So we're going to be giving away 5 of those. Pre-order that book if you don't win today, but this is going to go to everybody who is active in the chat. Also, if you have not gone to this page yet, what the heck is wrong with you? We have a phenomenal, Ethics and Compliance Week is right around the corner. We have a phenomenal toolkit. We've gotten famous for doing all these toolkits. This is the best toolkit we've ever done, I think. There is like 30 things on here. And I would encourage you, even if you haven't even thought about, can you imagine it's almost November? Even if you haven't even thought about Ethics and Compliance Week, I'm telling you, you can go to this page right now, get one thing and do something to get started this year. Ethics and Compliance Week is a great way to drive awareness in your organization. We can't do our job without activating those human sensors inside of our organization, and Compliance Week is a great way to get a little bit of engagement. So there are some games, there's some free posters, there's an avatar maker for people on your team. I'm only scratching the surface. There's like 30 different links on this thing. So let's get a massive round of applause for the Ethico marketing team who put something phenomenal together. Thank you for all those claps. But yeah, hit this code, and then also Joa, maybe you can drop into the chat the link to this page so you guys can see what's on there. I think you're going to absolutely love it. You're also going to absolutely love, ethics and compliance is moving from this sort of legal focused thing to a real kind of risk mitigating function inside of our organizations. And we need to make better bets with our time. A lot of organizations are still doing risk assessments in spreadsheets, etching your yearly plan without getting the engagement, without getting sort of real-time data, etching your plan in stone and hoping that things get done throughout the year. Our risk landscape is changing all the time. We've seen that across a bunch of things this year, from executive orders to AI ripping through every single organization. We need real-time data to make better bets with our time and make sure that our limited resources are directed to the things that are actually going to move the needle. When we can reduce risk in the organization and create this sustainable culture of integrity, it ultimately translates into a better workplace, of course, but it ultimately translates into the thing that the board cares about, that shareholders care about, and that's more enterprise value. So we have a lot of opportunity to drive impact inside of our organization, but we need data to do that. So we've launched this new risk assessment tool. It's highly flexible. You can run different campaigns on specific risks. You can do those in real time. You can run your entire annual risk assessment process through it as well. And so as you're starting to think about 2026, now is the time to check it out. We have a great risk intelligence package that lets you, get what you need and nothing that you don't. So we can have disclosures in there for you. Case management, issue intake, world's best issue intake and case management, not my words. Check out G2 if you don't believe me. And the risk assessment as well. So 25% off for all of you Ethicuties if you book a demo this quarter. All right. With that, how am I doing on time? I'm getting better and better at this, you guys. Okay, very good. Let's get a massive emoji explosion. One more for the one and only Jisha. How's it going, Jisha?
Hi, I'm happy to be here. I'm going to have to match your energy. Holy shit.
You got to turn it up.
Sorry.
The key is just a lot of coffee, okay? A lot of coffee. Okay. So we are going to be talking today about how do we turn risk into strategic clarity? You have a really cool background. For those of you who don't know Jisha, welcome to Earth. You guys are going to love it here. You're coming at a cold time of the year, but Jisha worked at Twitter. She worked at OneTrust, a massive organization helping a lot of other organizations really optimize their risk mitigation strategies. So we're going to be talking about going from police to partner. And I want to just dive in right away. into our discussion. So as always, you guys keep your comments coming in the chat. We will integrate those in real time, of course. But I want to start with this question for you, Jisha. When have you seen compliance excluded from strategic conversations in your organization or organizations that you have worked with? And what do you think the ongoing sort of trend that drives that sort of recurring exclusion? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and something that I think we hear a lot about. I just went to like a women in compliance event recently, and it was sort of the same kind of questions around like, how do we get to that table? And I don't think it's often like overt exclusion, right? I think it's rarely a deliberate sort of don't invite compliance, maybe sometimes, but more often it's sort of a neglect. It's like a benign neglect, right? People just don't think of compliance as part of strategy, right? They associate us with approving gifts or conflicts and hospitality and not really shaping the business model or helping to kind of navigate gray areas. But that kind of exclusion really happens after a few interactions where that compliance is seen as the node department, right? And it still happens. As an example, I'm the co-chair of a nonprofit board, and we have a lot of board members who tell me that my compliance department won't let me do X or Y or Z. And I look at the situation and I go, why are they saying no to this? So as much as we like to think that we've put that message out there, it still happens. And so the real question is, why should they invite us to the table in the first place, right? And that answer is, I think it has to be earned, right? It comes from demonstrating that we can help create clarity in uncertainty, or that we understand friction points in the organization. We can understand the business drivers, or show that our involvement will actually speed up decisions, right? So it's really about sort of being relevant and being reliable in any corporate setting. And I think there's, if you're providing clarity under pressure when everyone else is spinning, and you're the one who can, synthesize a complex topic and put forward a clear path, that kind of calm decisiveness builds credibility, right? And the other thing I think is business fluency, right? We talk about how you have to know the business, but I have talked to a lot of teams and seen sort of how, no, you don't actually understand the business, right? Just being able to say, like, from a marketing perspective, what you sell is insufficient, right? How does the company make money? What do their customers value? How is growth, actually happening in the company? And people who I think are invited are the ones who speak business more than they speak compliance. And so I really think it's about sort of, building that credibility, building relevance and what you bring to the table, and being able to pivot and show that sort of clarity when there's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, you said so much in that. So I hope everybody's been taking notes. But I think what you're describing is somebody that's adding value to the organization. I think people are generally self-absorbed. I'm not talking about myself, of course. Self-absorbed. They think about themselves first. They're looking for their own benefit before kind of anything else. And I think when you can be that calm in the storm, when you can provide that perspective, or you can provide some insights that maybe somebody else doesn't have, because by our nature, we're supposed to be the circulatory system of the organization. We're able to touch and understand, in theory, so many different aspects of the business. We can really bring a very unique perspective. And I'm just trying to understand from your standpoint, why do you think ethics and compliance has such a struggle? Like, we don't have a reputation for, being laser focused on the business objectives. You just talked about, I can say what we sell without really connecting to like what the essence of that is. Why is it so hard for ethics and compliance departments to either understand and let that understanding of the business objectives, or what the real challenges of the business are on a day-to-day or quarter-to-quarter basis, really animate or be a fuel for our efforts? What do you think's at the root of that, and how can we start to get that unstuck?
I think part of that is risk tolerance and fear, right? Where, you think your job is to eliminate risk, but really it isn't. It's to manage risk, right? I think earlier, particularly when you're earlier in your career and you haven't seen the worst case scenario, you start imagining the worst case scenario, right? If I say yes to this, what if X happens? Therefore, I'm going to say no, right? But the likelihood of that worst case scenario is very low. And I think sometimes we think in, the edge cases rather than thinking in sort of like what will likely actually happen, right? And putting a little bit more practicality to it. And so there have been times that people have said, oh my gosh, they want to spend $1,000 on this thing. And my answer is like, well, what's the context here? Like, is
Right.
it proportional? Is it okay? Just because it's $1,000 doesn't mean like you have to provide what that looks like and what are the alternatives. And so I think there is a lot of a fear and a lack of sort of risk tolerance. I think that you really have to understand that managing risk is about having a very strong spine and being able to tolerate some risk. And what is that maximum amount of risk that your organization is willing to take on in order to accomplish their objectives? You have to get aligned with that. And whatever that was at your previous company is not going to be what it is at this company. So understanding the business, understanding what risk tolerance is in that executive team's sort of viewpoint, and the rest of the leaders, and how do you adjust to that so that you are actually enabling and not just saying no because you're afraid.
Yeah, and I think something you said is very smart. It's about kind of overlaying sort of a likelihood of an event, with the, like a plane. Okay, maybe I've watched Donnie Darko 2 recently, but a plane engine could fall through your house, and that's a risk. That's not something anybody's going to sleep worrying about at all, right? Because the likelihood of that happening is extremely low.
Yeah.
Why do we struggle to apply that sort of likelihood to just the preponderance of potential risks that might happen in the organization? I mean, it's inherently hard, right? Because we're compliance folks. We think about worst case scenarios. To your point, we have a tendency to think about edge cases. Many people who self-select into ethics and compliance, they have a knack for kind of seeing around the curve and really, being able to like run that mental simulation and think about where something might go wrong. But how do we kind of balance that ability that might be kind of wired in us with this, likelihood kind of concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is like a shift in tone and even language, right? I think that it's okay to have certain fears or certain sort of, I think, concerns around certain movements. But I think you really have to kind of bring to it sort of the idea that you are talking about risk adjusted growth as opposed to sort of like risk avoidance completely, right? And
Right.
I think a lot of that has to do with sort of framing, instead of coming with here's the risk, right? Here's what, instead you can talk about like what's going to slow you down later, right? Here's how we can do this fast without reworking or regulatory surprises, right? And this kind of it's a reframing that's about execution excellence as opposed to like what are all the barriers, what are all the problems that could that could come. And so when you're creating resistance, I think a lot of that comes from language that sounds like judgment or delay. We can't, or we shouldn't, or the policy says this, and therefore, right? Even if I'm right, it shuts down the discussion. It's shutting down curiosity. And I want to be effective, not right. I want to be effective and not necessarily right. And that's a life thing too, right? Like sometimes you're having arguments and you're like, this isn't, I don't need to be right here, right? So you have to focus on like trade-offs and probabilities and not just the prohibitions. And so I think asking questions like, okay, like if we go down this road, the likelihood of regulatory scrutiny is very high. Here's what that looks like. Do we have the tolerance for that? You guys ready to take that? Let me draw you a picture. You good with that picture? Fine. I'm here to support you. I'll make it work. And so I think it really is sort of reframing and sort of, the tone and the approach that bring to the conversation.
Yeah, it's like it's not like you don't go on a road trip because there's some chance that you might get a flat tire. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You have to look at the treads, of course, but we have to have that. Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Well, and I was going to say also, like, I think huge part of a Ethico's role, right? Because usually you have a Ethico who is setting the mission and the vision of that department and what is it that we are doing as a group. You may have a lot of young folks on there who don't have the experience, because a lot of times it's experience that brings you risk tolerance because you've seen the worst case scenarios.
Yeah,
and guess what? We lived. We've survived it. I'm okay with it. And so because of my experiences at a hedge fund and dealing with an FCPA enforcement action, because of Twitter, et cetera, I sleep fine at night. Like I'm good. Like, and part of it also is like you experience life and you're like, look, life is not work, work is not life. Even if this things happens, yeah, maybe we get into a little bit of trouble, we're going to survive, but are we willing to take on that risk? And so I think you just have to balance all those trade-offs.
Something you said a couple minutes ago has really stuck with me. And it's that we're not in our positions to eliminate risk. We're in our positions to manage risk. And we're not responsible for the broad compliance of our organization. We're really more responsible for creating the circumstances for more compliant behavior, because there's always going to be errors. Businesses are growing quickly. They have different constraints. They have different pressures from the board, from investors, from whatever. And that stuff is changing all the time. And I want to talk a little bit about this risk paradox. And the risk paradox is really that, organizations need compliance expertise during high growth phases or times of stress, when maybe they're tightening the belt or whatever. And I think that creates an opportunity for us as compliance officers or compliance folks within our organization to really add a lot of value, kind of whether it's raining or whether the sun is out. In any one of those scenarios, whether you're growing fast or whether we're tightening the belt, we should have something that we're bringing to the table, and we should have a perspective for every single conversation, again, connected to how we can add value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of times it really is kind of focusing on the specific areas where you can bring value, because I do think that, I think a big part of our discussion these days is around risk assessments is like objective oriented risk assessments or, sort of strategy, right? And I think there is a point where you can say that sometimes there is no role for compliance in it, right? Like compliance doesn't need to necessarily be involved too early in certain processes, even in say strategy, right? I think it's about sort of precision and not necessarily sort of omnipresence. Like a lot of strategic objectives don't necessarily conflict with regulations, right?
Right.
And the real value is identifying like the few that might, like where does regulatory exposure or data use or third-party risk could materially affect that sort of execution. And I think when you're in a high growth environment, late stage startup, say, and you're trying to get to that IPO, you're trying to get to that acquisition event or whatever it is at that pace, obviously the risk tolerance is very high. And I think as a compliance department, you have to identify what it is that's non-negotiable and what's negotiable, right? Because everything's negotiable, right? In my opinion. And I think part of it is saying like, look, if some of these things break, are we okay with it, right? Are we okay with a little bit? I'll give you an example. When I was at a tech company, maybe I shouldn't go too specific about this, but like one of the discussions we had at the very top, the board level even, was, about what does 100% compliance mean for a multinational global company, right? Because if you're multinational and you're global, there are going to be any hundreds of laws that apply to you. You have to figure out which are the material ones, right? You got to figure out, it just goes back to an assessment of risk, like which are the ones that if we run afoul of, there is going to be massive, massive consequences to us, right? And so when you think about it like that, you may say, look, there's 5 to 7 laws here that we really need to focus on because if we violate them, we know the regulator is going to come after us and it's an existential threat to our business. And if we build a compliance program that is around these sort of standards, we can operate under that instead of trying to chase every single law, right? But that's a strategic choice you make about, look, there might be some puny law that comes out of South Asia that we're going to ignore because A, no one ever enforces it, or B, the fines are like barely anything. We're willing to, take that. And so I think those are conversations that you have to have in terms of, again, trade-offs and choices and being super intentional about like, what is it that you're going to focus on and not try to be everywhere at everything. And what's really important to your organization. And that really depends on the stage of the organization. What is the risk tolerance? What is it the executives want to accomplish? And what are they willing to, give up in order to do that?
before we can have those conversations with others or, leadership, I think we have to have that kind of a conversation with ourselves. So set up a mirror and just talk to yourself. I'm just kidding. But so let me tell you a little story. I used to, in my first job, I probably told this on the show before, but in my first job, it was a financial services job. And our work product was a report for private equity funds who were looking to do acquisitions. And the way that we did that work was highly influenced by the partner who was on that particular project. And so there was one guy that I did, a couple of projects with, and his reports were like 150, his reports, meaning my work, 150 analyses. And I remember doing some of these analyses and just being like, this is insane. Like this analysis doesn't even apply to this situation. And I finally got on this other partner's job, or on this other partner's project, and the report was 30 pages. And he was like, we really need to just zero, here are the big 3 risks with this deal. This is the stuff that we actually have to get right, because these are the things that are going to affect valuation. And it was that experience that really kind of taught me that like expertise in any field is knowing like what matters and what doesn't matter. I think that's why parents screw up their oldest children, right? Like the job I'm doing with my oldest son is very different than the job that I'm doing with my daughter, his younger sister, because it's like, I think everything matters. And then, with a little experience, kind of to what you were saying before, you start to say, okay, well, that doesn't actually matter. You kind of start to develop this materiality lens. I think, though, it takes some intentionality for us to accumulate the experience or look for opportunities to, add to that experience bucket, so to speak, to like build that materiality lens up. And I think once we can start to acquire that type of perspective, we can start to have those kinds of conversations that you were saying, whether you want to follow some puny law in Southeast Asia or really kind of come with a perspective that like, on no circumstance can we, cross this line. So I want to kind of ask you, I really like these shows to get very tactical and very practical, let's kind of talk about like, speaking the language of business and adding business value, and kind of stacking the deck in our favor to be more successful and be more equipped to have those kinds of conversations. When someone is kind of conducting an annual risk assessment, where would you tell them to typically start? I think there's kind of different views on this. Would you say to start with the strategic objectives of the organization, the sort of current landscape of, where the company is in its growth, progress, the things that are kind of coming down the pike from a business specific perspective, or would you say really start with that regulatory compliance requirement?
Yeah. And I think we should, zoom out a little bit, right? I think, everyone talks about sort of the DOJ saying, hey, a good program starts with a risk assessment. For sure. That's table stakes. You want to conduct, your risk assessment in terms of understanding the business and what are the biggest risks, and build your program around that. You do that, build your program, put that away. No one needs to hear about that. No one needs to talk about it. That's not the thing you talk with the board about, right? That's table stakes. You put that aside. And then in terms of sort of like a regulatory risk assessment versus a, sort of strategic objective assessment, I mean, I hate to say it depends, but it really depends on the maturity and the mandate of your function, right? Yes, sorry. But if your role is more operational or regulatory, I mean, you naturally you kind of have to start with that compliance baseline, right? What are the laws and frameworks or the controls, that we have to meet, right? And it gives you sort of a defensible foundation where no one wants to miss like material mandatory obligations. But I think if we wanted to take on that sort of strategic partner layer, then you have to layer in the company's strategic objectives, right? What are the growth plans? What are the new markets? What are the tech bets that we're making? What's the M&A activity that we're looking at, right? And figure out how those ambitions change your risk landscape, right? So I think in practice, if we're talking practical terms, it starts with the regulatory, and then you have to kind of pivot to the strategic piece, right? I don't think the sequence is necessarily the issue. It's the integration where what matters, I think, is that the risk assessment doesn't live in sort of like this compliance vacuum, that it has to connect to how the business is allocating capital, how it is chasing growth, right? And that's that integration challenge in reality, right? Like there's a cadence issue. There's regulatory assessments that are owned by one team. You may have a corporate strategy team that is focused on those objectives, but there's a practical barrier there where you're on different sort of processes and cadences. And so how do you synchronize, right? And the way, on a practical level, I've thought about it is, okay, corporate strategy team is putting together the strategic objectives for the coming fiscal year, right? They've put that draft together. And now I take a look at it and say, yes, okay, which of these objectives have a serious, regulatory component? For example, if we're planning to enter a new market, yes, easiest, obvious one. There's always going to be a data issue, a tech issue, sanctions and issues, right? But then it's also, well, what are the biggest barriers for us accomplishing this objective, right? Not just regulatory, but like, what are the things that are going to actually be the hurdles, right? And that's normal corporate strategic talk about, we've set this objective. Okay, yes, there could be the hurdle of insufficient funding, but what are the other things, right? And so I think bridging that all together takes a lot of sort of pivoting, understanding, building the relationship, sharing the value that you can provide and speaking in the language of this is a hurdle to meeting our objective as opposed to, this regulation is a problem.
This is not like a dummy job. There's not like dummies in ethics and compliance that can be really successful. I think it's about pattern recognition. It's about being effective, communication. Okay, well, fine. I'm not saying they don't exist. Okay. I'm just saying, like, look, ethics and compliance can be very academic. It can be done in a laboratory or up in some tower somewhere, or it can be kind of on the front lines of the business, really understanding like what the actual challenges are. And I think if we are myopically focused on words on a page, as opposed to opening that aperture and broadly seeing like, well, what is the true risk appetite of the organization? What are the strategic objectives for this quarter or for this next year? And when we can expand out, to your point, beyond just the regulatory aspect, but also to the, business risk aspect, we can automatically add a lot more value. And again, I always think that if we want to be a strategic advisor to the organization, everybody's always talking about that. They never invite me into stuff. We should be a strategic asset, a strategic advisor to the organization. Well, an advisor is giving advice, and the advice, if you're an advisor that's worth any salt, is going to be, both relevant and actionable, and it's going to have some kind of a context for where a person is at. And so I think when we can at least in our own minds start to think about, okay, how can I start to embody, what you're talking about? We're going to start to see opportunities to make some of these connections that, maybe we are uniquely privy to that other departments might not be. There's probably there's probably pinch points in an organization that, the strategy department doesn't know because they're not intimately talking to the middle managers in that department like we might, be doing if we're doing our job. David Parker said this is kind of an interesting point. Did you have something to say on that?
No, go ahead.
You were just saying, yeah, that was great. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
David said, this is sounding a lot like an enterprise risk management discussion. In your mind, like, where is that line? And is there a line? Is it a blurred line?
I think so. I'm not a big fan of like big, ERM discussions. Like I think it's, I've seen it done at banks, like when I was at JP Morgan, and that's a whole different ball game, right? There's regulatory requirements around bank requirements and liquidity, and testing and all that. There's that ERM version of discussions, but I think we are at a point where, sort of ERM has a bad kind of reputation. It's considered to be over processed. And there's so much focus on like risk registers and risk matrices and all of that. And I don't find them to be very productive. I think it's about, if we go back to it much more simply, back to what we talked about, it's about what are the hurdles to the company achieving its objectives? How can I help identify them? And then how can we engage in an exercise to mitigate them or do a scenario planning to say, hey, if we meet X, then we can expand into this market. What are the things that are going to, not allow us to meet X? I think it's a broader way of thinking than just saying, okay, here are the big risks and here's what the company has to do to mitigate them, right? I think it's a little bit different than an ERM discussion.
Okay, so when you have seen or you have yourself been successful in translating these kind of compliance concerns into business impact terms, what do you think made that translation effective? What is emphasized consistently and what is de-emphasized? Like what's left unsaid in those scenarios that like you would point to as maybe recipes to try to emulate or repeat, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's about how we make an impact and not necessarily like the violation of law, right? You don't start with like this could violate, X law or whatever. I think you really have to kind of, for me, the success is, talking about it in terms of how this is going to slow revenue recognition or how this is going to create customer churn, right? Or damage trust with regulators. That's a little bit different of a conversation, than I think talking about sort of like the infraction, right? And I think what makes it land is sort of specificity and scale, right? Like you have to quantify it in a way that the business is gonna feel it. Like we could lose access to a key market, right? That is a terminology that they can understand, and it's not an abstract sort of risk. It's an operational consequence, right? Of what could happen. I also don't. I think success comes from not moralizing or over explaining the rule book. I think the language is of trade-offs and return, right? It's not that we can't do this because it's too risky. It's here's a way to do this that is going to protect our growth and reputation, right? And I think your point about like what is left unsaid is really, really important, right? I don't lecture about compliance ownership or ethical theory. I think the executive audience, 9 times out of 10, my experience is that most executives understand that. Obviously, we've seen the bad apples, the McDonald's CEOs, and all these folks who don't understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the list is long. But in my experience, most of the executives that I've worked with are do want to do the right thing, and that's sort of table stakes for them, right?
Agree.
And now we're talking about a different level of conversation. And so I think for them, understanding that sort of, the business implication. And I would say also like, figure out the power centers, right? In your organization. Not every executive is a power center, right? Sometimes the CFO is, sometimes the GC is, sometimes it's the COO, right? It really depends. And who can be your ally in pulling them into those conversations, I think, can be really important, because if we're translating it into business terms, those can be really great allies in communicating that to the rest of the executive team.
So I love that point about the power centers. How would you advise somebody to start tuning into those power centers? Because I think sometimes we think, it's the big, scary sort of leadership. It's the board, and it's sort of this like monolith of gods upon Mount Olympus.
Mm-hmm.
But there are massive dynamics, and there's massive power, power differentials between a lot of those players. What kind of things do you look for? And how would you advise somebody to start tuning into that, kind of looking, piercing that veil a little bit?
Yeah. And I love these kinds of conversations because I think, one of my rules in life is like, make the relationship before you need it. Right. And so like all of what we talked about today is underlined by the fact that you need to go out there and know every person in the company and have a good relationship with them, particularly and we'll get to the power centers. Right. I think that like, this is something that probably came to me from my years as a litigator, as a lawyer, because, I'd argue before appellate benches, right? You have multiple judges, 3 to 5 judges. And there's 2 that are going to go for you, right? But then there's these 2 that are not going to go for you. There's the one that you have to convince. And that's the one you have to convince, right? And so it's not I have to convince everybody. I got to convince that one guy, that one judge. And so I think it's the same thing when it comes to business. I think there are certain executives I know I know who are gonna be with me, certain executives that I'm not really sure. I'm going to find out who their deputy is, who their right-hand person is. I'm going to become best friends with them and understand from them, hey, what is it that's going to make this happen with them, right? What are the things that are most important to them? And can I, if some of those things are I can't offer, can I figure out a way to get it, right? So I think it's part of it is being politically savvy, but not being political, right? Like nobody likes that, but you have to be politically savvy. And so you have to understand like who are the people, who is that one person that I have to convince in order to get this? And then there's all that practical stuff, right? Like the pre-meetings. You don't ever walk into a meeting with your presentation, cold, right? You've already had a meeting with every single person in
Right.
that room or their deputy. They already know what it is. It's just a formality and you're just talking details at this point, right? So yeah, I think understanding, and at each of my companies, different. Sometimes it was the CFO because they had the purse. Sometimes it was the GC because they were also the business affairs officer, right? It's different. You got to figure that out.
But you got to get around it. You're not going to look. You're not going to find this sort of dimension on an org chart, or just learning people's names,
No.
or over
No.
email. It's going to be through actual interaction and asking.
Conversations.
There's ways to ask about that. There's ways to sort of diagnose the power differential without
Yes.
saying like, so who's the most powerful out of you guys? Like no one's
Right.
obviously going to answer that.
You have to make it's the observations. You have to be the one who is observing very closely how, like, for example, if your company has a deal desk and finance runs the deal desk, okay, then finance is there's certain factors that you can look at. But if it's legal that runs the deal desk, that's different, right? So I think you got to identify those things. But I agree with you, not asking who's the power center here. That's not going to work.
This dynamic that we're talking about, though, I think sometimes we might feel like this is unique to us. Oh, we're excluded from things. I just got to freaking, I got to like get this lock unpicked. This is so hard to convince these people. I feel like that's true for everybody. Like if you're in a private equity fund and you have a deal that you're trying to get through, it's not like you just do this analysis and you bring it to, investment committee and then it meets the rubric and then they say, yeah, here is the money. There's people that you have to convince. If you're in ops and you want to do an investment, you still have to do this kind of a thing. I think where we might struggle is, pardon me, the reputation. You could see it in the chat. There was a bunch of horror stories. I told you that this was going to be a spooky episode. There was a bunch of horror stories about, people getting excluded, or a CFO saying, I would tell you, but compliance is in the room. There is a sort of a brand issue that a lot of us kind of butt up against. And I want to talk a little bit about how we can use risk assessments, these kinds of conversations, how we interact with the business to break down, these stereotypes and really show up like a business person first. We had Ross on one of our Tuesday healthcare sessions, which if you haven't come, you should check it out. We got a Ethico University next Tuesday as well, which we'll talk about toward the end here. But he said the best compliment he ever got from his CEO, who ended up being a mentor to him, was that, Ross, I never looked at you as a compliance person. I always looked at you as a business person first. So he developed some kind of a way to interact with the business and really kind of focus in on those business objectives and bring a unique perspective that, and people perceived as adding value. But what would you tell somebody on how to really elevate out of that thing that maybe they helped contribute to, that sort of like reputation, or they stepped into the shoes of somebody who really kind of embodied that and they want to really push their own brand or their own, department's brand forward?
Yeah. Look, I think it starts with understanding the business. Like one of the, and again, I can't stress enough how people think they do. Like I was at companies for 3 years and I was like, I still don't like, there's more to learn always, right? In terms of the structures. But I would say that there's also simple things. Like for example, at my last company, I had everybody on my team do the sales team onboarding. So you come to the company, you have onboarding generally as an employee, right? And this is where, as a Ethico, I would talk to every single new class about like what's it like in this new home and how we operate. But our sales teams had a separate onboarding as well. Like they do the general, then they had this, and it was very specific to like understanding the products. What are the sells? What are the plays? The whole thing. And it was a several day sort of, kind of program to enable the sales teams to kind of walk in the door and figure out, what are you doing here and how are you going to be knowledgeable? Everybody in the compliance team had to do that training because
Cool.
I want you to understand it at the level of the salesperson, right? And that
So smart.
required me calling in a favor from the head of enablement and saying, hey, listen, I know this is prime real estate, but can you give me a couple spots, like a one-time thing where my team can get the whole thing so that when they walk into meetings and conversations, they don't have to be explained to on like, what are we talking about here? They already understand like where we're at, right? And so I think it starts with that level of knowledge and credibility builds, right? Because, okay, you can, sales kickoff, another huge one where I went to and I nudged my way into a couple sessions so that we can meld what does it look like to do business, but do business the right way. It's not a compliancy separate webinar.
Totally.
We're going to talk about how this is all integrated. And I'm going to go to all the evening events, talk to all those folks and look them in the eye and say, hey, this is what I'm here for. Sometimes you got to leave it a little early because I don't want to see some of the stuff that's going on, even though we've had a conversation about like, hey, this is sales kickoff. This is not, there's still rules in place. You're at work. Like there's that conversation that happens before. But you pick your battles too, because there are some things where you're like, is this where I want to die? On this hill is where I want to die in this small little thing that they did? Or am I going to make the choice to fight the big ones, right? The important things. So
I love that. I mean, you can't die on every single hill. You got to pick your spots, and I think poker is such a great analogy for what an effective compliance officer should be. Like a smart poker player, you can win the tournament, not by winning every single hand, but by winning the hands that you need to win. And there's certain ones that you're going to go all in on, and there's certain ones that you're going to fold. It's about kind of that real-time risk assessment for whatever hill, we're kind of talking about. So how did you kind of elbow your way in? And how many times did that happen? I would imagine it was probably just a couple of times, and then you showed up as a confident person that was maybe the antithesis of what people feared you to be. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I think there's a lot of power and a lot of strategic benefit from that kind of a posture.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is negotiation, right? Like I mean, can I just suggest an amazing book? Maybe you'll give it away one day, or maybe you already have. I don't know. Which is like Never Split the Difference, the Mike Voss book.
Oh, Never Split the Difference. See, I'm putting it in practice right now. Yeah,
it's yeah. I see you. You're mirroring. I love it. I think that is like a book that every single person on the planet should read, because I think like whether you're a parent, whether you're a manager, whether you're an executive, you're negotiating every single day. And so like, as an example, the head of, the chief revenue officer, I said, hey, we're having our sales kickoff, can I do a session on integrity? And she was like, no, but let's figure, like the thing is full, but let's figure out a way. Let me introduce you to the person who's leading the thing, and you guys figure out a way to do this. I'm fine in theory, but like you work out the details. And so it was a lot of back and forth on like, what can we make work? They said some things like, okay, well, we don't want a junior person. It has to be you, because I was trying to send some folks, et cetera. So I think part of it is negotiation. Like, what are you willing to, what is like the thing that's really important for you? What is it that you're going to, say, okay, fine, I don't need that. But, or what are you going to offer them? Like, this has to be an exchange. What are you offering them? Yes, I saved the organization from, calamity and regulatory risk. Sure, fine. But like, what do you have that you can offer them? Whether it's time with their people to, give them something extra, et cetera. And so I think this all, like, I hear a lot of compliance officers saying, like, we try to do this and they say no. Well, as we all know, no is the starting point, right? Okay, so what's next? What are you gonna What are the 8 different things that you have on the table that you say, okay, maybe I'll do this. Maybe we'll do this. How about this, right? You may hit a wall. That happens. But I think the negotiation is, the fun part there.
Yeah, and no doesn't mean no. No means not yet, or no
Yeah,
means I haven't framed it right, or
1000%.
no means I haven't really figured out what is going to get something unstuck. But if we believe, like, oh my gosh, if I hear a no, don't start selling vacuums door to door if you're scared of no's. You know what I mean? Like, no is not yet. We have to find a way to put the ball in the net. We have to find a way to kind of gain some ground. And I want to go back to something you said about framing. I love the idea of using our, kind of bringing our, call it risk mitigation or risk management lens to, the business. I want to talk about kind of framing and how we can sort of apply this concept, because I think saying we shouldn't do this because this is going to trigger an enforcement action sounds maybe a lot different to somebody who maybe has a different risk tolerance than you. Then this is going to affect our ability to scale. Or this is going to impact customer trust metrics that ultimately drive gross revenue retention, or something like that. How can somebody get a little bit, so I just want to kind of dive into this kind of framing topic a little bit, and how we can use risk assessment or other data points that we might have to kind of drive those conversations, and how we can kind of think about improving our FQ, our framing quotient.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you're especially if it's in the context of like sort of flagging and exposure, right? Like, we're exposed here. You have to pair it always with the business context and the viable paths forward. We talked about that a little bit, right? I think we talked about it's not we can't do that. It's here's the regulatory threshold that we're going to be crossing, and here's the potential consequence, and here are the 2 ways that to achieve the same goal within the guardrails, right? That's the full sentence. It can't be just here's the
one-dimensional
problem, right? Yeah, exactly. And so it really is about signaling that we are here to enable outcomes and not police, right? That's if you have to figure out that path forward. I think it's also important to make a point between like avoidable risk and strategic risk, right? We've talked about that a little bit, but it's, avoidable risk is something like ignoring a sanctions, restriction. There's 0 upside to that. There really is, but there is also strategy around regulation. And so strategic risk is entering the new market or a product space where the rules are evolving. And so our role there is to help the business take that risk intelligently, right? With controls that match the exposure. And I think what's really important to keep in mind is sometimes leadership won't take your recommendation. Don't take it personally. That's okay, right? Like, there is the recommendation, fine, but again, to the point of negotiation, be ready to negotiate. Maybe not your principles, but the path forward, there's always ways to negotiate that, right? And in those moments, I think flexibility matters, right? You have to be flexible. You have to have alternative solutions ready. You have to stay calm and focused on how to meet that objective while you're within the guardrails. And that's how you become a little bit more influential rather than a box that you got to check.
This concept of being influential, because to your point, everything's a negotiation. The power that's attached to your title is really a mirage. Okay. People don't have to do anything. They sort of choose to do it. I think is both maybe a little bit scary, but in my mind, it's really very freeing, because that means that any one of these locks can be, picked. I've given this analogy before, but if you look at Disney, when they're trying to get people to come to Disney World, they have different types of commercials. They have commercials for the kids that look very different than the ones for adults. They have different sort of ICP, their ICP is, their ideal customer is a family, but they're marketing to these different sort of people within that ICP in very different ways. And I think, kind of to your point, when we can know our audience to a greater degree, we can probably frame out the way I'm going to frame something to a salesperson might be very different than the way I'm going to frame it to a CFO. The CFO might be more highly conscientious, more detail oriented than the salesperson who's kind of shooting from the hip and, kind of a gunslinger type. We have to be able to connect down to what drives them and slate it in a way that if in fact it is true, and if in fact we do have a strong position or a strong perspective that the thing we're talking about really matters for the business, I think it's incumbent on us to kind of, to your point, know that audience and really kind of put it in terms that are going to resonate with them. My man Kershwin here had a great question. How's it going, Kershwin? Talk about poker. You should have seen this guy at Cancero. I'm still thinking about how he took all my money at Cancero. Okay. So he said, this is back to the thing you were talking about, sending folks to the sales training, people on your team. He said, I love that idea, but at what stage would you require compliance to do the sales training? Stage it at like what stage in their tenure? I've sent colleagues too early and it was a disaster. Do you have any perspective on that?
That's interesting. I don't know if that's like the tenure of the compliance person or, if their general level of maturity. What I'll say this is that most good sales onboarding programs are built for a variety of levels, right? It may not be the VPs and the SVPs, but like most of those are built for people of, different seniority levels. So like if you're a compliance person, is it a different, I don't think that should matter. So I am very curious as to what was the disaster. Was it too early in their career at that location, or if it's like too early in their career in general where, they don't understand the business. But I mean, and I can see that, like, right, look, if you have a compliance analyst whose job really is to kind of get all the approvals through the system, maybe they don't need to know as much. And, someone who's a little bit more on the director level who really, if you want them to develop a career and, okay, definitely more. So I can see how it can matter more, but, I think, that really depends on sort of also what you're trying to accomplish and also what that team member wants, right? I think as leaders, so much of our job is to develop them and to understand what it is that they want to accomplish in their career. And if that means getting to a certain level, understanding the business is usually a pretty good one and, again, there's also building their relationships too. You want them to build, their relationships with those folks as well. So,
but it's such a great hack. I mean, regardless of the idiosyncratic kind of issue that maybe caused that thing to be a disaster, I think at a high level, it's a great hack because every business is driven by sales. That's where all the motions are. And just like, there's so much context to be gathered by sitting in that, not only from a relationship building perspective, but like, how are we actually going to market? Like, what are these true priorities? What are we actually pushing? So much of our job.
Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, in AI, the big thing is the context window, right? And like human beings have a much bigger context window than like any LLM. And so when we can load up more stuff in our context window, we're naturally going to make a lot of connections. And we have the access, we have access to a lot of different things that not every single department has. So we have the opportunity to really load that context window up. And again, leverage that, reframe it to really add value when we can connect it to the business objectives. Please go ahead.
Totally. Well, I was just going to say, I think also like, okay, iteration 1 was a disaster. You learn from it. Let's do iteration 2, right? I think you really have to be in a position of, and obviously this depends on your company and its tolerance for mistakes and failures and experimentation. But at my last job, there was a very high tolerance for experimentation. And so I don't think in my 3 years there, we did our code training the same way, right? Because it was like, let's try it this way, see how that goes. Let's try it this way. So like send your people to sales training. It's a disaster. You learn from it. Try it a different way, right? Start them off a little bit later. Fine, right? I think the point, like to your point about, it's not about the minutia. It's really about like the concept of like understanding the business in a real way.
So, I mean, that thing of iterating and trying different things, I think that's just how businesses work. And, depending on the maturity of the business or the industry of the business, that rate of experimentation or iteration, as you called it, might be at different sort of velocity levels, but it's always happening, right? There's new people coming in, they're going to try new things and so forth. And I think, again, if we're going to show up like a business person, we have to think like a business person, and we have to kind of flex that iteration muscle, which, listen, there's some chaos that comes along with new experiments. I just watched Frankenstein. Yes. There's a lot of experiments, a lot of dead bodies in that tower. I told you this was going to be spooky.
Well,
okay.
Yeah, we talked a little bit also previously, right, about how like strategic plans at a company change every few months, right? And so like your company's probably doing it, changing the objectives. And so I think it's fine for you to do it too.
So let's kind of talk about that, like changing landscape. AI risk is much higher now than it was, 18 months ago, right? That's something that skyrocketed. FCPA risk at the beginning of the year kind of changed a little bit based on people's read of these executive orders and so forth. So how do you think about a risk assessment? Because like we're always running risk assessments, like real-time risk assessments are happening every day as we're getting ready for work or driving to work or whatever. Inside the business, they turn into, like you said before, this sort of like over-processed thing with a bunch of these matrices and so forth that end up kind of maybe not driving the action. How do we find a little bit more of a middle ground, or how do we build a risk assessment muscle or process that can respond nimbly to changes that might be happening throughout the year, whether they're strategic objective changes or regulatory changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to like we said, I think it all changed. Just going back to something like you said, right? Like AI risk versus FCPA risk, right? Like it all changes depending on the context of your company, right? The external component of that is just one factor, right? Like to your point, like AI risk, right? If your company doesn't build any, then it's obviously a very different risk than if your company builds. So it's all contextual and on that. I do think that when we think about sort of nimble risk assessments, scenario planning is really important. It's something that people don't really do, right? Like when you are kind of looking at embedding that into your process, you're saying, hey, let's test how this all plays out, right? Like how this market shift could really play out across multiple futures or whatever, right? What happens if export controls tighten, or what happens if data localization laws expand? Here's what we do. I think all of that is about kind of understanding what's happening at the moment and not like a period of in time. I'm of the belief that annual conversation that the Ethico has at the board, at the audit committee of the board, where you present the risk assessment and your heat matrix is sort of out of date. Like I have no desire to have that conversation. If I'm getting half an hour in that quarterly board meeting, I want to talk about some other things, including like what's looking like at the future, right? The top 10 risks of the company, I think if they're okay, there's these 3 risks and they're massive to the company. And if this risk event happens, our strategic objectives are going to be obliterated. That's a conversation to have, right? Like there's a deep connection to how we're doing it. But like here are the top 10 risks of the company, not something that I think is an interesting conversation, right? It's already stale. It's not that, but
yeah, especially
it really
it's the same pen from last year and 5 years before, and there's already a bunch of controls in place. That's not adding any value to the discussion. I think again, we have to, like to your point, we got to be stacking the deck in our favor in creating circumstances to have impact. And again, talking about the same thing time after time just reinforces this stereotype of, oh, they're just risk averse. It's a bumper sticker on the car. It's a barnacle on the ship. I can keep going. But we need to be business people that are actually helping to drive the business forward, to your point. And I think we need to be able to kind of iterate through those kinds of discussions. And again, bring a new perspective, bring new data points that can inform a perspective for what's actually going on right now.
Yeah, and I think that, like, look, if there are 3 things that are overtaking the conversation at your board meeting in general, not just at the audit committee, if there are 3 things that are really perplexing the folks at the, if you're not connecting the through line to your function to those 3 things, why do they want to talk about this, like this random risk here? That's like, these are the things that are like blowing their minds. These are the things that are really concerning them. how do you connect it to your function and your, what are you offering in that way? I think that's just a different way of thinking about, how you can be helpful.
Well, my gosh, let's get a massive round of applause for Jisha. My gosh, look at the comments, Jisha. I don't know if you've peeked in there, but this is the best session anyone's ever seen. You're their favorite guest. Let's get a massive emoji explosion. We're only at 3,000. How could that possibly be?
That must be the bots. It must be the AI bots you have going in there.
There's no bots. Okay, this is all human.
These are humans.
Okay. Next Tuesday, we have an Ethico University. By your request, people want to see how we can put some of these things in. We talk about a lot of concepts. How can we get really tactical, really practical with the application of this stuff? Again, we have a very hard job. It's a lot to juggle. A lot of stuff gets kind of dumped on us. The scope of ethics and compliance continues to expand. The resources are not expanding along with it. So it becomes incumbent on us to make better bets with our time, create those points of leverage, and really show up like a business person who can really move the needle and help enable the business to go faster. So come next Tuesday, we have a great session there. And of course, next Thursday, every Thursday at noon Eastern except Thanksgiving, we are going to have another great session. So Jisha, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for
Love you all.
having me.
See you next week.